Hey, it's Shadow ACS again. I talk a lot about supernatural action anime on this show, mainly because it's probably the most common anime genre. And it's pretty well known that there's a lot of similarities and common tropes among supernatural action anime. Most of them star a main character in high school, have a supernatural girl as a companion or a love interest, and have the main character getting involved with some secret supernatural world that ordinary people don't know about. In many respects, today's anime follows a lot of these typical supernatural anime tropes, but in other respects it's something totally different. This is Ga Rei Zero. Ga Rei Zero is definitely one of the most depressing action anime I've seen. And I'm not gonna lie, that's kinda why I don't love it all that much. And normally this isn't something that would bother me. I mean, I love anime like 11 Eyes and Code Geass, and they're far from happy stories. But I think with those shows, there's a lot of elements in place besides the tragic ones. They're pretty big stories with a lot of different characters and things about them to enjoy. What I think keeps me from liking Ga Rei Zero as much as it probably deserves is that it's entirely about one specific tragedy, pertaining to just two characters. And that kinda turns me off from it a bit. I guess I just don't see much entertainment value in watching a show that has an unhappy ending, pretty much tells you from the beginning that it's going to have an unhappy ending, and has a story that's entirely about its unhappy ending. But I also want to stress that this is no way an objective criticism of the show. I mean, I do think it's technically better to feel sad watching an anime than to feel nothing at all. It's a sign that the show's screenwriting is powerful enough to connect with you emotionally, enough that you actually care about what happens. It's just not the kind of thing I personally enjoy watching. And there are a few actual legitimate complaints I have with the show as well. But I know I'm coming off like a total cynic, so let's just get to the plot summary. The show takes place in a version of modern-day Japan where the country is constantly ravaged by evil spirits, which I think are supposed to be invisible to ordinary people except for the select few that actually fight them. It's kind of badly explained. There's also a few government military programs whose job it is to fight the spirits, before they can cause people any serious harm. The story begins with a team of these spirit fighters being reunited with one of their old teammates named Yomi during a battle, who went AWOL some time ago. However, she seems to have gone crazy and is trying to kill them off one by one, including a girl named Kagura, who she was especially close to. We then flash back several years in the past, and the rest of the story details how the characters got to this point, showing how Kagura was taken in by Yomi's family and the two of them became the best of friends. And the rest of the show is spent showing us the bond Yomi and Kagura formed, all the while leading up to the inevitable tragedy we saw in the beginning. The best thing about Ga Rei Zero is also probably the most important part of it, and that's the friendship between the girls. I know this is a pretty cynical way of putting it, but it's just the right kind of sappy. We've all seen these cliches before, the shy girl from a strict family who learns to be much more happy and outgoing. The two of them hanging out, talking about girl stuff, and having a good time. Yomi giving Kagura a friendship bracelet to commemorate the fact that they'll always be together. But unlike a bad romantic comedy or chick flick where you know they're only using these cliches because they don't know any smarter way to write a story, here it feels like they really have an understanding of why these cliches exist and how they can make them work. You really feel the bond between the girls in this show. When Kagura breaks down crying thinking Yomi's going to leave her, it's a genuinely heartfelt moment. And it's so nice to see Yomi comfort her and tell her it's going to be okay. Any of the scenes involving these two girls together are done wonderfully. You feel every emotion the show needs you to feel. I like seeing Yomi act as a teacher and a moral center for Kagura, and I like seeing Kagura learn from her and become stronger throughout the show. And the fact that this relationship is done so well is a big part of why this anime is so hard to watch. Because we're told in the very beginning that at some point all of this is going to go horribly wrong. And that thought is constantly in the back of your mind while watching these two together. You almost go through denial in parts, convincing yourself that maybe these two can actually get their happy ending and that terrible tragedy we saw earlier isn't going to happen. I mean, Yomi in the beginning is such an incredibly likable character, so how could she turn out to be a monster who goes around killing people? And normally I love it when anime have bittersweet emotional undertones like this, but this is really bittersweet, to the point where it becomes a bit harder to watch than I personally enjoy. But again, that's not so much an objective problem I have with the show as it is a personal problem I have with shows like this. That doesn't mean it isn't well done. I had the same problem when I first tried to watch Angel Beats. It's a great show, but it's a tough one to get through if you're really affected by depressing and emotional stuff. Aside from the two girls, the only other really memorable character is a guy named Nori, a teammate of Yomi and Kagura's who Yomi's betrothed to. Which you would think would lead to a really terrible melodramatic setup with Yomi trying to break out of her tragic engagement with the man she doesn't love. And at first that seems like what they're going to do, but it actually takes it in a bit of a different direction than you might think. True, there is one part where they do a really dumb romantic comedy setup with Kagura trying to play matchmaker with the two of them by throwing another girl at Nori, which is about as stupid as it sounds. But the ultimate conclusion the two of them come to is actually a lot smarter. Even though the two are constantly fighting and know this is going to be difficult, they still care deeply for each other and want to try and make this work. I like that a lot, and I kinda wish we saw more stuff like this in romances. I also really like some of the art style in this show, in particular any of the action scenes that occur at night. I'm a big fan of bright neon colors up against a dark background, and this show really knows how to make it look good. And I appreciate that the show can do action scenes that aren't just animated well, but are also stylish and visually appealing to look at. So the show has its fair share of good points, but let's talk about the stuff that doesn't work so well. First of all, the supernatural action stuff in the show is not that creative or interesting. The action scenes are well animated, and there's one or two monsters that are kinda cool, but the powers they use to fight them, and even really the entire supernatural setup of the show, is really done to death for anime. The idea of a supernatural world people don't know about is standard and been done. The idea of modern-day exorcists fighting off spirits with supernatural powers is standard and been done. When you see the image of a Japanese schoolgirl slaying a giant monster with a supernatural katana, you don't think, wow, that's something cool I haven't really seen before. You think, oh, that's just ordinary anime stuff. Whatever. It'd be one thing if they really dove into the experience of the supernatural world like, say, Bleach did, but the supernatural stuff in this show just feels like it was made up on the spot by a guy who watched a bunch of other anime. I guess it doesn't really hurt the show a ton, though, because the focus of the show is supposed to be on the relationship between Yomi and Kagura. The action exorcism stuff is really just a backdrop for that. But even so, they could have made it a lot more interesting. Also, and this is probably the weirdest complaint I've ever had with an anime, the first episode is completely 100% pointless. The entire episode is spent with a group of characters that literally have nothing to do with anything and who we never see again. The only connection this episode seems to have with what happens later is that at the end of it, Yomi shows up and kills a bunch of people. Then, in the second episode, we get introduced to Kagura and her teammates, and we find out what their connection with Yomi is. I have no idea why they wrote it like this. Why would anyone think it was a good idea to waste our time with a completely useless first episode? I can only think of two things. One is that they were just going for pure shock value when you see most of the characters die at the end of the first episode, and the second is that these characters were in the original manga the show was based on and they wanted to give a pointless nod to them. Either way, it's one of the most bizarre first episodes to an anime I've ever seen. And as a side note, the characters that show up in the first episode are the ones that show up on a lot of the advertising. That's just straight up lying! Also, another problem I have with the show is that the ending, while not exactly inconclusive, doesn't feel all that satisfying. As I said, the show pretty much announces from the beginning that it's not going to have a happy ending, but that's not the issue I take with it. The tagline the show keeps using is, "Will you kill someone you love because of love?" Which sounds really deep, tragic, and interesting. And you want to know how the storyline with Yomi is going to build up to that. But without giving it away, when they finally get to the point where they explain how she turns evil, it doesn't seem like anyone's killing anyone else because of love, it just seems like there's a giant threat that needs to be stopped. And that's so much less profound and interesting than what they were building up. I also don't like how the main bad guy, who they've been building up since the beginning of the show, is never confronted or defeated by any of the main characters. Hell, they don't even really explain who or what he is. I mean, I get that that's not the point, it's supposed to be all about the relationship between Kagura and Yomi, but for all the hellish circumstances this guy puts our main characters through, it's just frustrating to see him get away with it. So as you can probably tell, I'm not a huge fan of this anime, but I certainly didn't dislike watching it. Where the show needs to hit its mark the most, it excels. It's meant to make you feel the loving bond between the two girls and make you feel the tragedy when they're torn apart. If that's the kind of thing that appeals to you, you'll like this anime, maybe even love it. Sure, it's got its problems, but in my opinion, none of them are fatal ones. If you're in the mood for something tragic, but in a good way, Ga Rei Zero is probably worth your time to check out. This is Shadow ACS, and I'll see you next time.